What if I told you that some Protestant beliefs might unintentionally echo one of the earliest Christian heresies that the church has ever faced?
So what that meant was, when he stretched out his hand to grab the bread, to dip it in the wine, then he was taking a piece of his kneecap, dipping it in some of the blood that perhaps was pouring out of his arm, and then eating himself, ingesting himself.
What if they're doing idolatry?
Yeah, that's between them and the Lord.
But could you be saved while doing idolatry?
So some people kiss icons and bow to icons. I can't do it. They do it and they say, hey, we see these as windows into heaven. That's a technical term.
Okay.
And this is, we're not bowing to the inanimate object. We're kissing it the way if you had your kids in your wallet, you pick out a picture, you kiss your kids.
I don't look at things that are dirt and put it to the holiness of God.
Gnosticism emphasized spiritual purity while rejecting the physical world, and some argue that certain strands of Protestantism, especially within Calvinism, have done the same by stripping away tradition, imagery, and sacramentality. So could this type of Protestant minimalism be more Gnostic than gospel? Well, stick around, we're gonna dive deep into this one. So let's rewind. Gnosticism was one of the first major heresies in Christianity. Though broad and divided, it generally taught that the material world was evil and that only the spiritual mattered. The early church fought very hard against this. Now, fast forward during the Reformation, Protestants rejected Catholic practices that they saw as unbiblical. But in that process, and what had transpired for centuries after, as a result of accepting this new and very foreign philosophy, did they go too far in rejecting the physical expressions of worship? Well, Robin Phillips in his piece, Are Calvinists Also Among the Gnostics, explores this very idea. And he points to things like the abolition of the liturgical calendar, the Protestant workweek, iconoclasm, and the austere redesign of churches as an example of Protestant dualism, separating the spirit from the body, the sacred from the material. This isn't about attacking Protestants. This is about being honest and evaluating if Protestantism echoes the same Gnostic dualistic heresy. So what if I told you that many Protestants actually do in fact worship like Gnostics, and potentially without even knowing it? So Phillips here argues that certain Calvinist reforms went well beyond purifying doctrine. They unintentionally echoed Gnostic dualism. Gnosticism saw the physical world as corrupt, favoring only the spiritual. Similarly, some early Protestants rejected not only just corruption, but also all material expressions of faith, such as sacred art, incense, vestments, relics, and even holidays like Christmas. In Puritan England, churches were stripped to bare walls. In 1644, Parliament passed an ordinance banning Christmas, calling it a popish festival with no scriptural basis. This echoed a view that spiritual truth must be untainted by fleshly celebration. John Calvin himself wrote, and I'll read this in my best John Calvin impression. God in creating man did not make him both soul and body, that he should cherish this fleeting and corruptible life, but rather that he should aspire to be better. This is from Institutes. And in his commentary on 2 Corinthians 5:1, he says, he represents the body as a prison, referring to Paul. These metaphors, such as the body as a prison and the world as corrupt, are, well, not far from Gnostic themes, as we will see here. To prove that Calvin's metaphor of the body as a prison aligns really well with Gnostic tendencies, you can quote the Gospel of Thomas, Corpus Hermeticum, and Origen's description of Gnostic beliefs. If you've been blessed by this content and you'd like conversations like this one to keep going, please consider supporting the channel, whether it's a one-time gift or a monthly donation. It helps us cover production, travel, and the time it takes to make these videos for you possible. There's a couple ways for you guys to donate. The links are in the description, and thank you guys so much for being part of the Lungs of Faith mission. So from the Gospel of Thomas in saying 29, if the flesh came into being because of spirit, it is a wonder. But if the spirit came into being because of the body, it is a wonder of wonders. Yet I marvel at how this great wealth has made its home in this poverty. Referring to the body, of course. Corpus Hermeticum, Tractate 1, it says, the body is a tomb, the visible is the prison of the light. The soul suffers imprisonment in the body. Yeah, well, again, this theme of the body as a prison just keeps coming back. And these are, of course, Gnostic writings. And then nextly, we will see an Origen writing against the Gnostics, where he beautifully summarizes their view in Contra Celsum Book 6. They say that the soul is punished by being enclosed in a body as if the body were a prison or a punishment. So in Gnostic texts, the body is consistently framed as a tomb or a grave or a punishment or somewhere that should be escaped. So when Calvin in his commentary on 2 Corinthians 5:1 says, Paul represents the body as a prison, it echoes this exact language. Intentional or not, this metaphor drifts towards a Gnostic anthropology. But Protestants will push back and say that their intent was not to reject matter, but to purify worship. And Calvin himself believed that God created the world good. The problem was with how it was misused in idolatry. Removing imagery wasn't about hating creation, but rather about safeguarding reverence. They would argue that what looks like austerity is actually faithfulness to Scripture. A return to the essentials, preaching, sacraments, and inward devotion. The focus on the word rather than ritual or sensory overload was about clarity and not contempt. As Calvin put it, a picture is nothing in God's sight. A picture can teach us nothing unless the Spirit is our teacher. Sermon on Deuteronomy 4. This tension climaxed in Puritan England, though. Churches were whitewashed, stained glass shattered, and organs were silenced. Crosses and statues were demolished, and the Book of Sports was banned. Worship became word only, mind only, aiming for purity, but at what cost? The early church condemned this kind of disembodied faith. St. Irenaeus, writing against the Gnostic heretics, insisted, "The visible is not the enemy of the invisible, for the flesh itself will be saved." And this is against heresies. Phillips argues that the Puritans created a sort of holy minimalism that unintentionally mirrored Gnostic dualism, rejecting God's good creation as if the spiritual and physical cannot exist. And how often do we see in many Protestant churches today this same kind of attitude towards worship? The heart of the tension, though, is not just about aesthetics or tradition, it's about the incarnation itself. Christianity is built on the shocking claim that God became flesh. He didn't merely use words to redeem us, but he entered into the material world, where he touched it, healed it, bled into it. So the rejection of beauty, form, and embodied worship undermines that central mystery. So if the material world is inherently suspect, it must be stripped away to preserve unity. But then how do we make sense of a God who took on materiality onto himself? A God who was born of a woman, wrapped in swaddling cloth, anointed with oil, crucified in the flesh, and risen in a glorified body. And here lies the very inconsistency. Many Protestants rightly affirm that if Jesus stood before them, they would fall to their knees in worship. But that instinct is profoundly incarnational. It says that matter can mediate the presence of God, that a body, a visible, a tangible, touchable, physical thing can be the very place where God dwells. But if you reject the idea that physical things can carry divine meaning, if you think kneeling before a crucifix or using incense is idolatry, then what do you do with the Word made flesh? This is where the logic really breaks down. You can't say, I would bow before Jesus' body, while denying that bodies, images, and sacraments and materiality have a role in worship. So the question isn't whether or not Protestantism is Gnostic in doctrine. Most Protestants fiercely affirm the incarnation. But in practice, some Protestant doctrines and traditions flirt with a kind of functional dualism, as I will call it, where spiritual things are exalted and material things are avoided, feared, and sometimes even condemned. Yet the early church knew much better than this. St. John of Damascus, in defending icons against the iconoclasts, said, I do not worship matter, but I worship the creator of matter, who became matter for my sake. An apologia against those who decry holy images. That is the incarnational logic of Christianity. Matter is not the enemy. It's the means by which God has chosen to meet us. When we reject materiality in worship, we risk silencing the very things and the very signs through which God reveals himself. Water, bread, wine, oil, gestures, and images, these are not distractions from true worship. They are the language of the incarnation. To deny them is to speak a gospel that is only half spoken. So are Protestants Gnostics? Well, not exactly, but some practices of theirs do risk echoing these very ancient heresies. And I would say in practice, sometimes they're indistinguishable. So today we've unpacked the history, the theology, and the tension that lies here between Calvinism, Gnosticism, and the Orthodox understanding. And we've also made some fantastic impressions of John Calvin. So if you've made it this far, thanks for thinking deeply with me. Don't forget to like, share, and let's keep this conversation going in the comments below. Do you think that Protestants are Gnostic, and what worries you most about it? And until next time, my name is Zach. This is Lungs of Faith. God bless.